Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have been enjoying the conference as much as we have. It has been an awe-inspiring, very truthful, very powerful 2.5 days. I'm Dr. Carol Henderson, Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer and Advisor to the President at Emory University. And it is a pleasure to welcome you to this session, Racial Healing, Next Steps in Racial Justice and Our Collective Liberation. I have the pleasure of introducing my counterpart, I would say my sister in this work, Dr. Annalise Singh. She is a professor in the School of Social Work with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology and serves as Associate Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development and Chief Diversity Officer at Tulane University. She does sleep at some time. Dr. Singh's scholarship and community organizing explores the resilience, trauma, and identity development experiences of queer and trans people with a focus on young people and BIPOC people. Dr. Singh has written extensively on multicultural and social justice, competency development in the helping professions, and equity and justice efforts in higher education. She is the author of the Racial Healing Handbook, Practical Activities to Help You Challenge Privilege, Confront Systemic Racism, and Engage in Collective Healing, and also the Queer and Trans Resilience Workbook. Please join me, and her accolades continue. I love this last line, though I want to mention this. Dr. Singh's TED Talks have explored gender liberation. She passionately believes in and strives to live by the ideals of Dr. King's beloved community, as well as Audre Lorde's reminder that without community, there is no liberation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Annalise Singh.
Thank you. Thank you, Provost Henderson. And can we slow down and just give Provost Henderson, Dr. Yolanda Cooper, and Jamie Weems, and all of the tech and the organizing committee, can we just make a lot of noise? Yes. We know that the last couple of days don't come out of the blue, that, freedom fighters within universities have just been working it, making, kind of tilling the soil and planting the seeds. So experiences like this can happen. And so I just want to say hello. It is great to be with you all. I just flew in from New Orleans. We'll talk about New Orleans in a moment, because if we're going to talk about racial healing, we got to talk about New Orleans. But I just want to say how very grateful I am to you all, to Oxford College, to Emory, to all the people who've participated in the last few days. These are the conversations we've been needing to have a long time. They're way overdue. And, as we move through today's session, you may feel some things. You've probably already been feeling lots of things, right? And it's one of the reasons I wrote the Racial Healing Handbook. So when I slow down and say, I'm grateful for you, that's not just because I was raised in New Orleans and my mama taught me to be polite and say, please and thank you, all of that stuff. But if we really think about what it means to care, to actually give thanks, to give the deepest bow we can to other people, we have got to talk about racism, white supremacy, all the things. We just know that that's the most the most transformative thing we can do in our lifetime. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is transformation. I know that for folks who are in person, you're like, I did not give you the best font, so I want to apologize to you all. But today what I'm going to do is go over 10 core racial healing practices. I hope they're useful to you. And I also want to just talk about the context of where these practices came from. This is a pretty personal session, so it's really not about anyone else but you. So I hope that you, by the time we end this session, that you feel more grounded and seated in yourself. And it's about action. And so as I get started, typically I would have joined you by Zoom virtually, but I had to be here, Provost Henderson. I had to be here with you all for this conversation because, as you know, not enough of us are having it, right? But if I was Zooming with you, I'd be Zooming from, how many of you have been to New Orleans? Raise your hands. All right, how many of you love New Orleans? Make some noise. Okay, the hands just went, woo! Even if you haven't been to New Orleans, you love it, right? But let me tell you about Bulbancha. Let me tell you the original name of New Orleans, the land we now call New Orleans. The Chitimacha First Nations, they called New Orleans, Chitimacha, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi. Let's say it together, Bulbancha. It feels big and powerful, right? As it should be, as that land is. And so as we get started talking about racial healing, there's absolutely nothing we can say about racial healing and exploring that for ourselves until we come back to the land, right? We come back to the land that was often unceded, stolen. That's the land I work on every day in Bulbancha, and it's something I'm always thinking about. Coming back to Atlanta, I spent 30 years in Atlanta, and I did a lot of activism and community organizing in BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and specifically Asian Pacific Islander communities. So you can imagine my thoughts. I think it was in March when the Asian Pacific Islander folks, who I would assume, but I probably shouldn't, identified as women, were murdered here. I fell to my knees that day, literally, because I knew that area, I knew that community, I knew who was going to be stepping in to give support and comfort and care and start working on repair. And then I also knew who wasn't, right? We know that story in the land we now call Atlanta. But I want to call their names into the work that we do together, because of course there's a through line from anti-API racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Latinx racism, anti-Middle Eastern racism, anti-mixed race racism. There's a through line from all of those things that is really grounded in anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And so you'll see the other image I have on this slide as we get started to just slow us down and think about the land that we're on, feel what it feels like to be on land that is unceded, not just a land acknowledgement. I mean, First Nations people are still here, right? That's the other part of acknowledging the land. Sometimes we forget that part. What does it feel like to live in a country where, what happened in March in Atlanta is as old as the origins of the country we now call the United States of America? What does it feel to have the conversation you've been having over the last few days, when of course we can call George Floyd's name and we can remember how we felt that day, and even recently when Chauvin was convicted of multiple counts of murder, right? But do you feel the memory fading? Do you feel it fading? I mean, if we sit here and be really honest with ourselves, right? And that honesty can be love and compassion and accountability, right? That's how white supremacy works. But I apologize again for the people who are here in person. You probably, maybe it's bigger than I thought. For the image of George Floyd that was on the cover of the New Yorker back in June of 22, it was painted by an artist, Kadir Nelson, and he's making a statement about every single thing you've been talking about the last few days, that we can't think about that he was murdered, a Black man was murdered by a white police officer, and that just happened, but there's all this history of anti-Blackness, of white supremacy, of white enslaver behaviors, right? We've got to start naming it for what it is to be able to heal. And so as we kind of move forward, the other thing I want to bring into the room is trans and non-binary folks, specifically Black and Indigenous folks. Specifically, we'll talk about why in a moment, Dominique Remy-Fells of Philadelphia and Rhea Milton of Liberty Township, Ohio. After George Floyd was murdered last year, Did you hear their names? Do you remember them? You know, we don't, because we still treat Black, trans, and non-binary folks as throwaway lives. And I say that with a lot of anger and like crassness, because that's what happens at the intersection of trans prejudice and anti-Black racism. And so I don't know how much you all have engaged I kind of saw from the program, you're definitely talking about colonization, right? So anti-Blackness, white enslaver behaviors that fueled enslavement practices in this country were definitely built on colonization practices, right? We'll talk about that as well. And what that did for my precious, beloved queer and trans community is it started to erase this beautiful gender and sexual orientation variance that's actually not just the legacy of my queer and trans ancestors, right? But if you identify as cis and straight, raise your hands if you do. Yeah, I'm asking y'all if you identify as cis and straight. Yes, you can put your hands up, proud too. It's your legacy too, because cisgender folks have been put in boxes that just fit really nicely into white supremacy and kind of grind out all the mechanisms. So the gut check for us today, there's so many gut checks you've had, but I think one of them has to be our commitments, our actions around creating spaces, learning about our own identities so that we create more thriving, empowering spaces for Black, trans, and non-binary folks. They don't need us to empower them. They need us to get out of the freaking way and stop killing them, right? So I know that's a pretty like strong way to start, but I have a feeling y'all have been, kind of strong with one another and bold and crashing into each other the last few days. And this is just the reminder, as you're here, I mean, I even felt it as I came into your space. I was like, I want Tulane to have this conversation. I mean, we're having it in different ways. I felt the impulse to change someone else, right? Do you feel that while you're here? You're like, I gotta go and make this change and that change. Just for this amount of time, I want you to think about yourself and come home to yourself and really use this time to dig in, because it's very rare that we have this time, right? Especially in the times of COVID-19, which is you're having this conversation amidst multiple pandemics, right? And how many of you the last few days have kind of felt your heart break? Yeah, raise your hands, right? Maybe you felt like the pride of your ancestors of resistance, right? Black communities who've always resisted enslavement, right? Those moments of joy and pride and lineage sit right alongside all this terror, right? And so I want you to bring some of those feelings back into your mind, especially if you identify as white or non-Black. I think I'll talk about my race in a moment, but I think, we have the luxury of not thinking about race and anti-Black racism on a daily basis. But when we do, we start to feel, and I think we start to be able to feel our way back into our humanity. And so this next slide, this is a lot of words on a slide. I should apologize for this, but I want you to guess who said this quote, right? And it's a long one, so maybe someone can help me read it. Who wants to read the first line? Are you up for reading the first line?
You, who are in the field of psychology, have given us a great word. It is the word maladjusted. This word is probably used more than any other word in psychology.
Awesome, thank you. All right, are you thinking about who said this?
Should I read the second one?
Yes, please.
But on the other hand, I am sure that we will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted.
The next one?
There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill.
We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. Okay. We must never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence.
Any guesses? All right, come on, we're in Georgia, y'all know. It's Dr. King, right? There's so much we could say about Dr. King, but let's stay with what he's trying to tell us with this quote, right? It comes directly back to the theme of this conference, this time that you've spent together, right? It comes back to feeling, right? What he was telling a largely white audience in the 1960s of psychologists who had studied like hell, like, let's study maladjustment. Let's study like how to get people more individuated, right? Let's study how to make people more white is what it was really about, and still about in my profession. That's a whole nother workshop. But I think what he's telling our profession, at least mine, I'm trained as a counseling psychologist, is actually maladjustment. We need it. We need to feel it. There's something in ourselves that should feel that image of the heartbreaking, right? I'm not saying that I want you to feel that all the time, but white supremacy demands that we go numb so that we don't feel it, right? And you all have been talking about all the things that you're not supposed to be talking about, right? Which, you know, when we start to look back at history, when we start to look back at our ancestors, our lineages, just where we work, where we study, where we live, right? We come full frontal to this question of, I think, our lifetime, which is, you know, it's kind of a forced choice thing when it comes to the repair that's needed in the world because of white enslaver behaviors. And Paulo Freire says it pretty well. He says, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. We know we can't be race neutral and post-racial and all that, but then what do we get so comfortable about every day in our work, in our personal environments, that we don't remember it's a forced choice? We're either helping people adjust to white supremacy and systemic racism, or we're helping challenge it, right? That history is now. Is today October 1st? Okay, first of all, take your hand and pat yourself on the back for getting to October 1st, because we've been through a lot. Let's just say that. But this is the question, right? It's no other question. So we're going to talk about a lot today. When you leave this conference, there's going to be this forgetting that white supremacy demands from you, takes from you, wants from you. And then there's going to be something you have to reach for. And I don't mean this in a cheesy rainbows and unicorns way, but I do love rainbows and unicorns. But that imagination, you know, that imagination when you take history and you come real in terms of truth and reconciliation, but then you start to dream, right? It's not a cheesy rainbows and unicorns thing. It's something that actually freedom fighters, abolitionists have always done. They've always planned the movements around kitchen tables, in places of worship, on the streets, in cars, and there's been some part of them that imagined a different world, right? Let's take it for a moment. Can you imagine a world free of white supremacy? Working on it. Thank you for the back. Wow. Yeah, I mean, even now, I mean, I have a feeling, because y'all are here too, you think about these things so much, right? And even for those of us who do, it may feel hard to dream about it. Well, maybe even take it to Oxford College, or, you know, kind of larger Emory as an entity. Can you imagine Emory, like, undoing white supremacy? Uh-oh, I got some like, no. It's overwhelming to think about, right? But then what if you start to think about your own life and your own moves, the moves you make at Oxford College and Emory, right? The moves that only you can make. I think that is the imagination I want you to bring yourself back to, because I do think it's a question you have to ask yourself as we look back at the brutality. And I just want to name, you know, the brutality. My mentor, Resma Menakem, who wrote an incredible book called My Grandmother's Hands. If you haven't gotten it, get it ASAP. It's like way better than anything I will share today. But he actually asked us, do we understand that the origins of everything you talked about the last few days came out of like a particularly brutal form of whiteness, right? Western Europe. I mean, think about, I know some of y'all watch Game of Thrones, right? I mean, remember growing up in history and you learned about the feudal systems and the serfs and all those, like, it wasn't even 1%er societies. It was like 0.1%er societies. That was purposeful. That's the energy that came over and created manifest destiny and said, this land is mine. If you look at some of Christopher Columbus's journals, how many of you have read some of his journals or the People's History of the U.S.? You remember the intro to Howard Zinn's book? Columbus, we know he didn't land in quote unquote America, but when he landed, he writes in his journal how amazing and beautiful and muscular. Ew, he was already like fetishizing them, right? The indigenous peoples, how kind they were, how much they offered them food and drink and sustenance. And then the next line is, it would only take us about 50 men to overtake this whole community and take the land. Mic drop, right? So it is a question we've got to come back to. When you sit with the brutality of what's happened, right? We've got to think about who was doing that. And then you've got to think about, is healing from racism even possible? And I'll ask you that question. I mean, is it possible to heal from racism? Is this something you even believe? This is kind of bringing you back to that dreaming thing, right? Is this something you think can happen in your lifetime? What was that? Yeah, I want you to answer it. I definitely want you to answer it. And I'm sure in the chat box, y'all might be having a conversation. I hope you all are. Yes? Raise your hands. Okay, I see one hand in the back. Some half hands. Yeah. Maybes, raise your hands. All right, look around. A lot more hands. No, raise your hands. Woo! Okay. I'm going to try not to assume a lot about people's races, but I just saw a lot about who was like, nope. And critical race theory scholars tell us a similar story, right? They tell us that there's a permanence of white supremacy, and then when white folks get involved and say, this works for us, when it works for us to talk about like enslavement and descendants, we're going to do it. When it doesn't work for us, we're not going to do it. The thing is, one of the things I did, I'm a researcher, as many of you are, and as I did my own research, I researched racial healing, racial justice, racial equity, but I also started to look back at abolition movements and racial justice liberation movements around the world. And what do you think I found their answer was? Yes. I mean, it's hard for me to say it because it's hard for me to imagine it in my lifetime. But the answer they gave us was yes. It was yes. But I think what I found as I looked at research, as I looked at abolition movements, that there was always a proactive set of steps and strategies that were literally planned, and people's lifetimes were used to move in that direction. And so I think where I've come from, and I think for you, you've got to go on your own journey, is that, do you think it's possible? I think wrestling with that question on a daily basis, thinking about what are the practices that you can use in your lifetime to promote that healing for yourself and other people. But I think the best thing I saw across the research and the liberation movements was, as we begin to heal from racism, as you begin to engage in that journey, other people felt like, maybe I can do that too, right? Not surprising, because we don't know what it looks like, right? What does it mean to heal from racism? Well, as I looked at these two bodies, lived experiences, research, I started to see a definition of what racial healing could be. And the first one had to do with stereotypes. I was hella mad when I saw this. I was like, this is not an implicit bias, like Starbucks thing where you go and you learn about unconscious bias on a Sunday, you shut down all the coffee houses, and then you open the coffee houses back on Monday, and everything's fine, right? I was super mad when I saw this research. But there's so many things in the implicit bias research that have to do, take your hand, either hand, put it on the back part of your brain, your brain stem. This is your dinosaur brain. I'm so sorry. We all have one. We especially have one. I was remembering Atlanta traffic on the way from the airport here. I was like, wow, New Orleans, we don't do some of the stuff that we do here in Atlanta. But our dinosaur brain just sorts people into categories all day long. And not just race, all day long, 300,000 times like in a day. Just take that in. It starts to make you feel really overwhelmed as well. So implicit bias, even though it makes me mad to think that, well, I mean, it's not that simple, it is a piece of it. Because you all know, you've been engaging the last few days, that there's a huge system of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that implicit bias hooks into and defines who's dangerous and who's safe. And even for those of us as people of color, I get really mad. I did this study with queer and trans faculty of color. And there was this one theme that participants talked about. And it was this one white cis straight guy in their head that told them that they were wrong and they were bad. And they were so pissed that that dude lived in, I would say, our brains. You know, so this implicit bias, it's a thing that's happening for all races, right? And for folks of color, I think, you know, when it comes up for me, I feel shame, I feel guilt, right? That's not mine. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the other thing that I found in what racial healing could be is that it's really about recognizing the wounds that have been created, not just in people of color. It's so much easier to think about internalized racism, internalized inferiority, internalized self-doubt, internalized imposter syndrome, right? But as one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Sherelle MacArthur says, she's like, who's the real imposter here? I mean, she turns that whole idea on its head. I mean, James Baldwin said, you know, Black communities have to know more about white communities than white folks know about themselves. Why? Because all folks of color navigate white supremacy. The dirty little secret and this tricky trick thing about white supremacy is it doesn't want us to think about internalized dominance with white folks, right? And I know white folks, I know that's why you're here. I know that's why you're attending online. I know it's the hardest thing to talk about and make someone else change for, right? But again, I want you to come back to yourself during this session. But once we do that, I think for people of color, often we're fighting racism, we're supporting one another, we're moving in different ways to counter racism, that we're standing up for ourselves, that sometimes we don't even have the time to go back and be like, dang, there's this icky belief system that's still inside of me and I don't want it there. Maybe it's an idea of how you should look or how you should feel or how you should act. And certainly those are artifacts of white supremacy, yes. But sometimes we're fighting so hard against oppression that we haven't had a chance to heal what I think is that little kid inside that never learned that as people of color, you were precious. You are precious. Your life is so important. It's so important. Your life is so important. For white folks, when you start to look at that internalized dominance, you can start to realize like, oh, okay, the cost of white supremacy are right here in my own life. And I think for all races, it was a weird thing to do in the Racial Healing Handbook to write a book that was for people of all races to engage. But I wanted to do that because that's how the movements were built, right? There were multiracial movements, definitely led by Black men, women, most likely queer and trans folks. We've lost some of that history. But when we do that, we can work to stop participating in systemic racism and notice how it drives not only differential privilege and resources, right? How many of you know the percentage of Black wealth post-Reconstruction? Anyone read Mercer Baradaran's book, The Color of Money? Get that book. It directly comes back to what y'all have been talking about. 0.5% of the US wealth, 0.5%. Any guesses for what it is in 2021? 1%. Are you mad? I'm mad, I'm angry, I'm livid, my body starts to sweat. That might be TMI, but like I feel myself get hot. I want us to move from like feeling the feelings to taking the actions, but we actually have to feel those feelings. If we're ever going to build Black wealth within Oxford College, within Emory University, in Atlanta, in a real way that isn't just calling ourselves a Black Mecca when we know what the rates of housing and wealth are in Black communities, right? We got some work to do, and it's going to be, and we can do it. It's the thing I saw from the freedom fighters over and over again. We can do this. The answer is yes. But when we do that, we start to take action to challenge systemic racism and white supremacy. So how do we do this? How do we make change? If we're breathing in white supremacy all the time, you just heard the history, you looked right at this land, right at what's happened in your own university, right? There is a calling to action, right? There is an unabashed kind of saying, hey, from this point forward, we're going to find a way to heal, and we're going to find this way together. And so that's what I wrote about in the Racial Healing Handbook. On the top 5, there's the Racial Healing Wheel, and the top 5 strategies are really, it's been cool to go back home to live in New Orleans because there are these beautiful oak trees, right? It's kind of how I think of the Racial Healing Wheel. The top 5 strategies are your roots in the ground. They keep you really connected. They're practices you do internally. And then practices 6 through 10 are the ones where they're the beautiful branches that move into the world that you can only do with other people. And so I also want to slow down, and you might be like, what? Who the heck is talking to me? This person's behind a mask. Like, why is this person interested in this? I'm going to share my why with you. But as I share my why with you, I want you to, again, come home into yourself and think about your why. There's a reason you're sitting in the seat. There's a reason you are attending on Zoom. There's a reason you're watching this recording. What is it? I think that your why is going to be something that you come back to ground yourself, kind of like your North Star, over and over and over again. This is where I talk about my family. It never gets any easier, but for you, think about who raised you. Was it 2 moms, 2 dads, a mom and a dad, a grandparent? Were you adopted? Did you grow up in foster care? Were you raised by extended family? You got those people in your head. Did you, despite who thought they were raising you, did you raise yourself? Most of us did, right? You got those people in your mind? Just nod your head. Okay, I kind of think of these people as they wrote this book. And the book was called How to Know Your Place in the System of White Supremacy, How to Move Through Systemic Racism. They didn't know they were writing it. It was already written for them, right? These were the folks who wrote my book. On the left is my mom, a white person, a white woman from northeastern Louisiana. She could, and still can, trace her white lineage all the way back to Scotland, an unbroken line of names and property. As far as I can tell, never quote unquote owned people, right? I put that in quotes for a reason, because her family certainly benefited from white supremacy. And there was something about passivity and okayness and the brutality of just standing and allowing, right? That was passed down in her family, that internalized dominance, right? And so, she met my dad. That's a whole story for another time. But my dad was not from northeastern Louisiana. He was actually born in the country that we now call Pakistan. So the British had colonized India, right? And then they sliced India in half. This is why South Asians, y'all like to call that be the change, Gandhi, all that. And we're like, side eye, not such a great guy. Read a little more about Gandhi. My point is, there were real freedom fighters like Sri Aurobindo. That's another workshop too. But my dad, as a Sikh person, Sikhism is a religion, he and other Hindus and Sikhs were forced to move from what's now Pakistan into India, and Muslims were forced to move in the opposite direction, from what's now India into what's now Pakistan. You know, orchestrated quite a bit by white folks, by colonization. So when I think about the people who wrote my book, I mean, I got good times. The colonizer, the manifest destiny folks, the folks who are like, this is my frickin' land, mine. I might not own people, but white enslaver behaviors, there were white folks celebrating, benefiting, profiting, owning property because of all of these things are artifacts of white supremacy. That's my mom. My dad, he was 12 years old. When I think of the ways he could parent me and the ways he couldn't, I think about trauma, the trauma of white supremacy globally. This is my family in front of the very dirty Mississippi River. And you can kind of imagine, I'm 51, born in 1970. Our family didn't look like what a lot of families look like in New Orleans. New Orleans is now 60% Black post-Katrina, which I like to call Hurricane US government, because we always knew the levees were gonna fail. But the one thing that I noticed growing up in an interracial family where my parents actually couldn't get a marriage license in Orleans Parish, they were denied because my dad was seen as Black. My dad worked at Xavier University, worked at a HBCU, and I noticed that my dad wasn't called a terrorist, he wasn't beaten, he wasn't called the N-word, he wasn't called a lot of other nasty things when we were in an HBCU environment. But when we stepped into the white community, I was noticing what was happening, right? And I'd ask my dad, why do they do these things? I didn't know, like, why do white people do these things, right? I'm not saying other folks of color are not xenophobic and all that stuff. But what I'm saying is I was learning as a young child pretty quickly. My dad would say beta, which is a term of endearment in Punjabi, like they don't know what they do. And so what did I learn about my place in racism and white supremacy? As I'm telling my story, I hope you're thinking about what you learned from the books that you were given, right? The things that were helpful or not helpful. My mom's passivity around the racism that my dad was experiencing, the comfort. One of the things I've had to do as a non-Black person of color is to really look at internalized anti-Blackness in terms of, I received literal comfort from that HBCU environment. There's so many ways I might not even be here in front of you if it wasn't for Black communities. That's the story of Black folks taking care of other folks for like generations, right? What's your story? I'm gonna bring you back to your story right now. This is kind of a lot of words on the page, but how many of you have looked at racial identity development or know about racial identity development? Did you know that your race has an identity? You not only have a race, but it kind of changes over time. You know, I think this was not in the book I read growing up, but it's racial healing practice number one, because I think in this work, when we start to think about healing and repair and restoration, and I don't think fixing is the right word, but addressing that truth and reconciliation thing, it's often easier to be like, I got a race. It's harder to think that your race moves. It moves because white supremacy moves. And there are all these tricks around white supremacy that we navigate through. So I'm going to explain this racial identity development model in a couple of minutes, and I want you to think about no one else but you. This model is going to divide people into people of color, BIPOC folks, right? And white folks. Inadequate categorizations, we need to say Black and Latinx and the AAPI and white and Indigenous when we mean those groups. But Dr. Janet Helms, Black woman, racial identity scholar, developed both these models because she knew there was something happening related to mental health and racial trauma and privilege. And then Dr. John and Joy Hoffman, they put these models together. They were in student affairs. There was like there's something happening here where people miss each other. They're trying to do good race work. They're maybe not trying to have a conversation, but they wanted to have these models together so they could talk about interactions. So you ready? Think about your race. You got your race? I know you know your race. But do you know this? Do you know that you were born into a world that was conforming to whiteness, this idea that white is right, white is tight, white is the right way? Do we know that? Nod your head if you know that. Okay. It's weird to think that that's for folks of color too. We're born into that same world, even if our parents are like, hey, this is how you navigate white supremacy. This is how you put your hands on the wheel. This is how you don't bring your food to school. This is how you hide different parts of yourself. This is how you learn to speak, quote unquote, white, right? But for folks of color, I'm talking to you, no matter how much our families prepared us for these moments that racism would occur, and they often did, it's not until we're outside of our families often that's when it happens, right? I remember Miss Margaret driving by our house, white woman, she'd call my brother the N-word, would flip the bird at us, and I would, and my brother and I, we'd be playing in the front yard when this happened, and we would tell my mom, who was white, we would tell her what Miss Margaret did, and she was like, she didn't believe us. So for folks of color, we're often away from our families when these experiences of racism occur, but we're confused. We're like, wait, our parents tried to prepare us for this, but actually it just happened to me. And then we try to tell white people, sometimes we try to talk to white people about race. And white folks are in that acceptance mode of racism and are just dismissive. Might be like, oh, maybe that was something else. That's literally what my mom would tell me. It's once you start looking at racial identity development, there's so many stories you can remember of your own life. Well, for folks of color, I'm talking to you again, when we try to talk to white people about race and they don't listen, what happens? We get pissed, we get angry, and then we get targeted, right? I want to welcome you back to your boundaries. These are our boundaries. Our anger, that disillusionment, when we start to trust that, wait, I tried to tell you about my experience and now I'm done with you, right? I think so many times, especially those of darker skin, get targeted in that place, right? Oh, you're so angry, right? For white folks, they see folks of color being like, wait, you didn't believe me, now I'm pissed. And white folks double down into resistance. Now, this is racial identity development. It happens over time, right? White folks start saying, well, white folks experience racism too. Or, Annalise, do you have to play the race card? I mean, do you really experience racism? That questioning, at that point, folks of color are so done. We're just like, we're so done. And we move into our own communities and receive nourishment and support. And I can talk about an experience I had with racism at Tulane in my day for 5 minutes, and then I can have dinner with my community, make my grocery list, talk about what I'm binging on Netflix. I can talk about other amazing parts of my life. I don't have to convince anyone that what happened to me happened. I get support, I get it off my chest, I move on. White folks see folks of color moving away from them, and they're like getting a little nervous. They move into retreat, which for white folks, this is actually the most dangerous part of your racial identity development. For people of color, it's dangerous because there's a lot of masking. And we saw that last summer after George Floyd was murdered, that it was like, okay, yes, I'm here to like Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I'm here for it. But the actions weren't lining up. It felt not real. It felt like the white folks texting black folks to be like, how are you doing? Right? It didn't feel real. And for white folks, I don't want you to think about another white person. I want you to think about you. And when you are in retreat, because for each one of these schemas, they're not linear stages, but they tend to flow in a direction, but we can flow back. For white folks, you're just going to go into retreat. It's part of your racial identity development. And your job is to know when you're in retreat and build that muscle to know how it feels in your body. So you can then move into emergence, which is typically when you're working with other white anti-racists and developing accountability around, wow, we went to this amazing summit conference for the last 2 to 3 days. What are we going to do now? We're working with one another, right? For folks of color, I want you to know this racial identity development model, because when you're angry, I want you to trust yourself so deep in your bones that you set that boundary, and you know that if you don't set it, like your life is going to be taken away from you. And when I say that, I'm literally talking about the research that shows that the telomeres of people of color get shortened from racial trauma and racial microaggression. Your boundaries are the most important thing we can set in our lifetime. And I want you to remember that schema around immersion, when we find joy and connection with one another. That's Black brilliance, that's Latinx pride, that's all the hashtags that are actually real experiences. Racial identity is not a one-time event. All right, raise your hands if you thought about yourself as I was talking about that. Okay, good. Racial healing practice number 1. Number 2 is exploring your internalized racism. I kind of already went over this one, but for folks of color, this is often work we do with other communities of color, the people we often trust the most. What is that piece of internalized racism that I've still swallowed whole in terms of believing that I am inferior? The pride part of me is Dr. Annalise Singh can tell you all day long how proud I am of my mixed race self and tell you about all the communities I formed and all the practices I've developed to help me. But when I'm in majority white spaces, I know that little Annalise is there, that little Annalise who got so hurt around racism and didn't quite know what to do. And when she shows up, how do I put the love on her and tell her she's not bad, as opposed to like being like, well, dang, like I should have prepared more for this presentation, or it's usually a list of things that run commonly in our heads. For white folks, this is your work around internalized dominance. It's that dirty little secret, right? In your everyday moving through the world. How does that internalized dominance show up? Not if, but how. Make the list, right? And as we go through a racial healing practice number 2, you can see from the cycle of socialization that we're all born with the mechanisms of white supremacy just grinding on us every day in every way, right? And through that socialization, we're just bombarded with these messages, right? It's history, it's current, it's future. White supremacy wants to last. But when you start to pop out of the cycle, then what you can do is start to challenge the status quo. And the status quo isn't going to like that. It's going to be punishments. And white folks, welcome to the punishing world of white supremacy. Racial healing practice number 3 is about relearning the history of racism. It's asking yourself, what did you know? How many of you learned new things today, yesterday, the day before? Raise your hand. Okay, things you never knew. You're engaging this racial healing practice right now. And there are 4 portals for this practice. One is that we know that white supremacy and systemic racism is not innocent. That racial ideas, as Dr. Ibram Kendi said, are created by racist people. Now, did y'all talk about the origins of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism? Did y'all engage that? Or has it been mostly on this land? Did y'all talk about the origin story for all my Marvel folks out there? Who knows the origin story of anti-Black racism? Anyone want to take a shot at it? Anyone know? Anyone know? Anyone in the Zoom room want to chat it out and let us know? Isn't it interesting that we're in a room full of really awesome people and none of us are raising our hand? Ooh, I know the story of anti-Blackness. We don't know where to start. That is yeah, it seems like so huge. How many of you know about Prince Henry in Portugal? Okay, some of you know about, okay. Okay, Rachel Burkus said something in the chat. Colonizers, yes, colonizers were definitely kind of that piece of it. But if you haven't read Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, a definitive history of racist ideas in America, get it. It's like this thick, but like, listen, it's the thing that we didn't have growing up. So what he says is that Prince Henry in Portugal, they'd been enslaving people for a really long time. Humans have always actually enslaved other humans, like humans can suck that way, right? People who've been enslaved have also resisted enslavement because humans do that. We resist, we want to be free. But what Prince Henry in Portugal realized is that when darker skinned folks were escaping enslavement, as humans are wont to do, they could capture them more quickly, see them more quickly, and tie that to more money. You have the birth of anti-Blackness in a whole different way. There weren't racial categories before then. Carl Linnaeus is coming up with his little botanical categories around flowers and plants, and then he starts categorizing humans: red, yellow, white, black, right? And what is he attached to everyone but white? Black, primitive; indigenous, primitive; red, primitive; yellow, evil, right? White, governing laws, civilized, right? That birth of anti-Black racism about 500 years ago then got shipped over to the land we now call the United States of America about 400 years later. And it got shipped onto a land that had already been colonized. And so the second part of reteaching yourself the history of racism, which it sounds like you've been doing, is that colonization is a practice of racism. That in our country, we know, if we're not First Nations, that we were all immigrants to this country, right? We know that the most common language that has ever been spoken on this land is what? The most common language that's ever been spoken, and it still is true in 2021. It's maybe the second most common language. I should give you yes, Spanish, right? Cherokee. Yep, Cherokee was that first, if we talk about the indigenous peoples, yes. But even at that time, Spanish was spoken in larger numbers, right? We know that the Japanese citizens were interred. We know Chinese railroad workers were promised citizenship and then thrown away, right? Immigrants were often labeled as foreign or a threat. So racial healing practice is number 3. It's kind of what you're doing as you're together in this experience, but are you honoring that for yourself? Are you really feeling how you're changing? We had a conversation. You were like, I'm here for it. Some people have been saying, I'm going to take a while to process this, right? But have you slowed down and really thought about how this has felt to be together? And so racial healing practice number 3, it is kind of like about reading. It is about reading is not enough. We know that, right? But if we don't read, we don't change. And we do know that knowledge is powerful. So just think to yourself for a moment. What are the racial groups that you know, when you think about the history of racism and white supremacy, that you know a lot about? And what are the groups that you don't know as much about? Ask yourself that question and start reading in that direction, because you really have to develop your own history lesson plan. And when you do this reading, when you realize you not only have a race, but that it moves, and that it moves forward and back, sometimes in a couple of schemas at once, when you realize that I'm reteaching myself the history of racism, we're going to grieve. We're going to grieve because we know that white supremacy is real, and that there's a connection between racial identity and grief. For white folks, that retreat space I talked to you about in racial identity development, that's like a doubling down masking place, right? It's where I'm not going to talk about white supremacy, but I am going to say I want racism to end, right? It's also connected to cultural and social norms, right? I want you to think about your culture right now. Is it supported that you would cry? Is that okay? Is it supported that you would get angry? Is it supported that you might be scared? I think culturally, we can definitely talk about the different parts of grief. They're commonly talked about denial. If you think about the last person you lost, right? Or, we had Hurricane Ida in New Orleans. There was a lot of loss. At first, people were in denial. Wait, this isn't happening. Or anger that, wow, this did happen. Or bargaining, wait, did the hurricane happen? Did it not? And then sadness about what was lost, and then acceptance. But this grief that I'm talking about at racial healing practice number 4, it's actually about your whiteness. It's about being Black. It's about being Latinx, AAPI, Indigenous, First Nations. It's thinking about your own racial identity development and realizing when you do go into denial that white supremacy shapes who we are. When we do get angry about how it does, when we start to bargain about, well, maybe I've developed enough pride that I don't really have to think about this anymore. Or whether we escape the sadness, right? And the acceptance is not like, yay, white supremacy, yes, I accept, but it's more around, now I'm going to actually understand that white supremacy is something that drives feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and cultural and social norms. Racial healing practice number 5, probably the best thing about writing this book is that the National Museum of African American History used this step in their online curriculum. And I think they did because it's kind of a quick Cliff Notes cheat sheet about when you are in relationship, when you have retaught yourself, when you've thought about your race, when you've actually said grieving is a part of living beyond and living through white supremacy. You know, you do need to not only read and reflect on what you've read, but then when you go into your work environments, your personal environments, you've got to remember to take some risk. And when you do that, when you take risk, when you interrupt racial microaggressions, when you raise your hand and ask the thing that no one wants to ask about reparations, about truth and reconciliation, about what happens after this amazing 3-day conference you've been in, there can be rejection there, right? But that you keep building the relationships because you're not pointing at the president or the provost or anyone else to do this work. You definitely hold those folks accountable, but you're doing the work for you. And so there are practices in the Racial Healing Handbook that really help you interrupt racism, that help you express curiosity or offer alternative perspectives, or even share your disagreement or set boundaries and maybe ask to continue a conversation later. We just went through the top 5 part of the wheel, and as we go to number 6, this is about catching ourselves in the flow of racism. You might have experienced this as you were here together really practicing racial healing practice number 3. You know, you might have been like, hey, we're all here with this common goal, but we've had interactions that are replete with racism in this community. A lot of these are racial microaggressions, right? And Dr. Kende, Ibram Kende, I love that he says, maybe we shouldn't call these microaggressions anymore. Maybe they're actually abuses and they add up over time. And you know what? He's right. When you look at research, it's that telomere thing. Our telomeres, people of color, our telomeres get shorter, right? That's why your boundaries are so, so important, folks of color. And let me just go on a mini rant here. For folks of color, for BIPOC folks, if we want to give to the movement of racial justice, and we often do, awesome. But I want you to think about the titrated level of how much you give and when it starts to deplete you, right? Because we didn't create racism. We didn't create white supremacy. It's actually not ours to undo. But the thing that's detrimental and heartbreaking about racial microaggressions is that for folks of color, you know, sometimes we're stoic and we're like, oh, that didn't affect us. But maybe that little kid inside is like, wait, did that really happen? Was that racism? Maybe that wasn't racism. We start bargaining with ourselves, right? Sometimes we make it okay for white folks and we say, well, maybe they're just curious. Or worse, the worst for Emory, the worst for any higher ed community, the worst for our society in general, is when folks of color, we start to wonder if maybe actually we don't fit, if maybe there actually is something not right about us, and we start to question ourselves. White folks, internalized white dominance, a racial microaggression happens, and what do? Do you laugh? Do you do nothing? What are you thinking to yourself? Internally, what's going on as you see all these different categories that racial microaggressions can come in? Racial microaggressions, it's not the only thing we need to talk about, but look at all the categories. This is the research of Dr. Daryl Wing Su. This idea of who is perpetually foreign and does not belong in the land we now call the United States of America. The ideas of who is a criminal, the ideas of who gets to deny their racism, the ideas of kind of perpetuating a myth of meritocracy, or who's a second-class citizen, right? Once we get into number 6, it's about how do you interrupt those racial microaggressions? You know, I want you to think about maybe one of the last ones you experienced and how it made you feel. And for white folks, it's often the one you committed or the one that you didn't interrupt. One I often hear is like, what are you? And I'll never forget I was working at a psychiatric institute and there was a white woman who heard another white woman ask me what are you? And she was talking about my race, and the white woman stepped in and was like, actually, that's a really fucked up question to ask. And I was like, wait, what? I couldn't believe a white person interrupted it. I was so used to asking that question. I'm not saying that white woman saved me, but I am saying I got to eat my lunch without the same level of stress that I might be like, oh, wait, now what am I? So for when a racial microaggression happens, and we know from research they happen all the time. And so building that muscle about, okay, being curious about what you think and feel for yourselves, but how do you interrupt those racial microaggressions as well? Racial healing practice number 7 is about understanding racism in relationships. It's kind of creepy to think about, but when you think about everything you've talked about today, this is what has shaped your school, your work, your community, your friendship, your dating environments. And so you can literally come back into your working environments and talk about who are the racial groups you've worked with a lot, or you haven't worked with a lot, or what are the racial conflicts that everyone knows are going on, but no one's talking about. Identify those patterns with one another to shift them. We're not going to go through all these questions, but I want you to think about your current or last partner. You might identify as asexual, and that's awesome. Think about your best friend, your most trusted advisor at work. You can look at the second column, your last house guest. That's a weird one in pandemic times. The neighborhood you grew up in, your favorite place to vacation. You know, for white folks, my guess is it's going to be a lot of white. For folks of color, my guess is it's going to be a lot of folks of color. What does this do when our communities look like that? It's hard to crash into each other and do this racial healing practice with one another. And so racial healing practice number 8 is reclaiming our whole racial self. Notice that it's not until number 8 that I say, okay, now who really are you? Like, racism is the base that we have to think about in our own healing. Yes, we have a gender and a sexual orientation, and some of us have a religion or a spirituality. We all have an age, right? But if we don't look at race and racism as the base of that, we've got white supremacy at hand, right? We've got the oppression Olympics that Angela Davis talked about. So when you go back into your work and your personal environments, if you're doing the deep work of anti-racism, you're going to have to talk about gender and sexuality, but don't do it on without a conversation of race. And so racial healing practice number 9 is about allyship. You'll see some do's on the screen. And I know racial allyship has become a little bit of a dirty word, but the truth is, for folks of color and white folks, we need to have a strong allyship base and understanding of what that is, so then we can actually move towards accompliceship and being a co-conspirator and putting something on the line. There are a lot of don'ts you want to keep in mind as a racial ally. You don't want to appoint yourself. You don't want to kind of say you're an ally all day. You don't want to avoid grief and loss. And, you know, as we get to practice number 10, you can see the first 5 practices were really about yourself, right? By the time you get to practice 10, it's about what you do with everything you talked about the last few days. What is your role? What do you have to offer? What do you have to give to the movement of racial justice and liberation? You know, I know that you all have been posting and reposting on social media. You're spending moments of your life here. But I want you to slow down and think about one of the 4 roles that you can have in the overall movement. Are you a helper in the movement of racial justice? Are you someone that actually, you know, made the nitty-gritty pieces of this conference happen today? The people who work behind the scenes make parts of racial justice and liberation movements happen. Or are you an organizer? Are you someone who can see at Emory, yeah, this is what happened. Y'all have engaged that the last few days. This is what's happened in the past. This is what's happening now at Emory, and this is where we need to go because of that. Those are your visionaries, your organizers. Your advocates are the policy wonks. They're like, the systemic racism is living in this systemic inequity. Are you an advocate, or are you a rebel? Are you the one that's going to raise your hand, get out in the streets, and is the person that says the thing that everyone's thinking or no one is thinking but must be talked about? Are you a rebel? If we don't have enough, let's just do raise of hands. Who thinks they're a helper? And I'd love for the Zoom folks to check in on this. How many of you are more helpers, all right? How many of you are more organizers? And you can look around at the room, okay, our visionaries. What about our advocates, our policy wonks? Okay, we need a few more advocates because I'll talk about that in a moment. And how many of you are rebels? There are two things about this list. If you don't have enough helpers, you can go back like Monday and have this conversation in your teams. If you don't have enough helpers for the movement for racial justice at Emory, you ain't getting anything done. Nothing's changing. If you don't have enough organizers, you don't have a vision. If you don't have enough advocates, policies, practices, I mean, everything stays the same. If you don't have enough rebels, you have a lot of groupthink. If you have too many rebels, you're not getting anything done. But the truth is, when we kind of think about these four roles, we can move into the cycle of liberation, out of that cycle of socialization where white supremacy gives us such a small option of choices, right? And the last thing I'll say as we wrap is that, practice number 10, I've been thinking about a lot. The book came out in August of 2019, but you might have read an article by Nicole Hannah-Jones called What is Owed? It came out last summer. And she really put some dollars on the lines when we think about reparations for white enslaver and colonizer behaviors, right? Reparations specifically to Black descendants of the East Atlantic slave trade. And does anyone know what the numbers are per person? How much it would cost to do reparations? $150,000 to $170,000 at least, in that range. And does that feel like a lot of money? It kind of sounds like a lot of, some people are like, no, not enough, right? For people who, when I talk to you about this number, they're like, that's a lot of money. We'll never be able to do that. I have two words for you. COVID-19, infrastructure bill, $3.5 trillion. We spend where we put our values, and you all know more intimately than many other people will know at Emory, because you've spent this time together, that the journey ahead in your own racial healing, it's going to be about dollars. 0.5% Black wealth post-Reconstruction, 1% in 2021. Absolutely unacceptable. And the only way to change that is through doing your internal work so you can reallocate resources. And yes, I said that. And y'all can make some noise about that because you know it deep. I'm serious. Y'all can make some noise about that. Y'all can make some noise about that. You've been immersed in talking about mega trauma. I just want you to remember that it's not just, oh, you can leave here and do something about it, but actually, as John Lewis would often ask when you would see him around town, he would often say, Annalise, what kind of good trouble are you getting into? That good trouble is about reparations. It has to be. And when it feels impossible, I want you to treat it like science fiction, right? And so the last quote I'll share with you is that when you get doubtful, when you stop feeling, when you forget that you have a race and a racial identity development, I want you to remember Arundhati Roy's words, because it's always been true, that another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Reparations is on its way. It always has been. It's going to happen. It's the question of whether it's going to happen in our lifetime or not. And you all will answer that question as an Emory community. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you all so much for being here today. Look forward to questions. And do I turn it over to Provost Henderson at this point?
She done gave me a promotion. Vice Provost, there is a provost here. I see the dean in the back who's shaking his head.
Well, you know how it is.
Yes.
There's a dean, and then yeah.
Anyway, I want to thank you so much for, these kinds of talks can be very jarring for people when we speak truth very straight, no chaser. So I just want folks to know I feel that in the room. That might be new for Oxford, new for Emory. I think there are people in here who do this work. I'm looking at Alex and others who use this language and are comfortable with that language, but everybody isn't. So I just want to acknowledge that in the space. And Annalise is used to that because she does this all the time. And there's a spectrum of this work that we're doing.
Yes.
And you will have to get in that spectrum where you fit. But if we're going to do the work of racial healing, we have to understand what that scope is. Racial healing is not comfortable. Racial healing is not for the faint at heart. And so I look forward to engaging this work, to continue to do this work and probe and stretch. This is about stretching.
Yes.
This entire symposium has been very clear about the direction we have to go as an institution to enact change. And it's not pedaling in place. It's often stretching that marathon mile. Sometimes I feel that's what this work is. If you think, I've never run a marathon, so this is a person that has never run a marathon. But I understand, if it's 26 miles, you get to that point where you hit the wall. And that's when you have to keep going.
Mile 17.
Yes, so that's where we are. We're trying to get to that. So we're opening the floor and the chat for questions, if you will. And then I think we're going to do this for a few minutes because I know you wanted to break people up into groups. So let's do questions about 5 minutes and then we can break into groups. So Arthur online has asked this question. I'm cisgender, Black, 63-year-old Episcopalian. I know that race is a social construct.
Yes.
And that we need to deal with racial identity development as it relates to both interpersonal racism and structural racism. But are there racial healing resources like the Hoffman model that integrate the genetic anthropologic out of Africa human origins research, which demonstrates that the entire world was largely, if not completely, populated by folk who left East Africa thousands of years ago, which is why our genetic makeup is 99% identical, even though we think we look so different?
Thank you for this question. It's a beautiful one. There are racial healing practices all over the world, and I think that one I would specifically, in my framework, put under racial healing practice number 3, because when you reteach yourself that actually, when I think about my discipline of psychology, I read in my history class and was taught that William James, this Western white guy, invented psychology. But the truth is he just coined some words. Many of you may have coined theories or came up with phrases, right? He didn't actually create the things that we've come to know as psychology. Those things had to become created in the continent of Africa, just where math and science was created. If you think about the Hippocratic Oath, if you don't know about Imhotep, we could have had the Imhotep quote, oath, right, for medicine. So for each of your disciplines, I think what this person is offering, there is the healing, and certainly it has been for me, of going back in our fields of study and realizing that, yes, we do share all this DNA. And if you really think, it gets into the origins of humanity, which is probably a whole other conference. But I think we all had to have come from a Black woman, if you think about how people are born, right? And so, yes, when we realize where we all came from and where humans migrated from, I think, does this group know that? Do y'all raise your hands if you kind of know that? I figured y'all would, right? Most people don't. And so I think this person's comment is really, really important.
I will, just keeping up with time, I think we need to do the groups now because we have 3:30, and so it's going to be a quick group exercise, but I'll turn that over to you right now.
So I just wanted you to have, I talked about a lot of content, and I know you've had people lead prayers or reflections or blessings, and all those things are also important. I just wanted you to experience a little bit of grounding with a person that's near you. So I'd love for you, if this feels right for you, check in with your body and see if it does. I would like you to just pair up with one person and just answer this question. What is the piece of racial healing that feels most resonant for me in terms of my next steps after this experience that you all have had together the last few days. So the question is, what is that very next step in your own racial healing? Please introduce yourself to one another, maybe share your pronouns, like, and you've got about 7 minutes for this. I know it's not a lot of time, but I want you to have some time with one another. Any questions before you go into your pairs? Yes. Yes, I will go back to the wheel. Yeah, for chat, I think if you all could have that conversation in the chat about just what you think is that next step in racial healing for you based on this conference experience, right? And remember, there's so many different ways to heal from racism, right? So it might be something on the wheel that I presented, but it also may be something else from another practice that you have. All right, so ready, set, go. If you need me, just wave me, chat me in Zoom, and I'm happy to get with you. And does everyone have a pair? Anyone need any help getting a pair? All right, ready, set, go. You got this. You've got about 3 more minutes. Take the next minute to just thank your dialogue partner and wrap up your conversations. Okay, if you can hear my voice, maybe give me a couple claps. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, but that was just so, yeah, to bring you all back. I know you need more time. You do need, here's the trick of white supremacy. You need more time, and that amount of time was perfection. It was perfect. You had the conversation you needed to have. Adrienne Marie Brown says, you know, there's always the perfect conversation that's in the room to have about injustice and liberation and freedom that only the people in that conversation can have. So I just trust your dialogue partners. So that's your life and your commitment. In my culture, we call it dharma, the purpose of your life, that next step in your racial healing. I want you to trust it. It might have been tough to identify. It's going to be hard to remember tonight and tomorrow morning. I want you to be gentle with yourself and accountable. Folks of color, you're going to hear me remind you of your boundary setting again. In the system of systemic racism, no one is looking to give us like the rest and restoration we need. So we have to create that for ourselves. Your life is precious. Your being is precious. Your lineage is precious. And your freedom fighting ancestors would want you to live your life as fully as you can. White folks, I'm talking to you. Folks of color didn't create the system of racism. We can't really undo it. Well, we've challenged the heck out of it every generation. We always will, we always will, we always will. What we need are the generations of white folks saying, no more, not in my name, I'm done. It's not about feeling guilty or ashamed, but it's going to come up, and that's okay. And so as we close, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to invite you into an embodied experience. Some of you, I'll lead you through a couple of questions. I'll ask you to close your eyes. Many of you have experienced trauma, so closing eyes is not good for you, right? So if closing eyes is not good for you, if participating is not good for you, I don't want you to participate. You can just sit quietly. You can check your phone or whatever you want to do. If this feels right for you, you can start to close your eyes and just start to feel maybe the seat that you're on, maybe your feet are on the floor, and just take a quick body scan, like with your eyes closed or gently open, gazing at the floor. And just notice how your body feels after talking about racial healing. We talked about a lot. It was kind of intense, actually. The last few days have been full of emotions and knowledge and realizations. And when you think about the last few days, just notice what feelings come up for you. Notice if you're feeling more numb, or if there's a certain part of your body that wants to move, maybe let it move for a moment. And as you start to come into the body, I want you to remember yourself when you were young. I talked to you about little Annalise. I want you to think about your name, and I want you to think about your little person, right? That little person inside that was socialized into learning their place in the system of racism. And I want you to tell them that you believe them, you trust them, you're always going to be reaching for them, because the things they were taught were so unhelpful and so harmful. And they did absolutely nothing wrong. And you're going to put the big heaping compassion and love on them as you move into a lineage of the march for racial justice and liberation. And as you connect with that little part of you, I want you to take a deep breath in. And as you exhale, I just want you to let all of the stress run out of your body. I want you to just release all of the tension that may have come up in our time together throughout the few days together. And I want you to connect with that inner voice that really is the truest voice. It's the one that's always been with you, the one that's never going to leave you. And when I ask you what your next steps are in your own racial healing, I want you to listen to that answer. What are the next steps in your own racial healing? What are the next steps in your own racial healing? And the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is take your right hand, if it feels comfortable, place it on your heart. And again, just notice the feeling that's coming up as you place your hand on your heart. What is that feeling? And as you place the left hand on your heart, what is it that you need? Considering this conversation, this dialogue, this learning, this knowledge, this movement you're really creating, what is it that you need to remember? Finally, I'll ask you to take another deep breath in. And then exhale. The very last thing I'll ask you to do is to imagine a world without racism. I want you to imagine what that would feel like, what it would taste like, what it would smell like, what that experience would be. You may have had absolutely nothing come to mind, and that's absolutely okay. You might have had a lot of images come to mind, and that's wonderful as well. And the last thing I want you to do is take another deep breath in, let that out. And as you slowly open your eyes, if they were closed, and come back into the room, I just want you to start looking at these people. If you're on Zoom, maybe look at the screen and look at me. Just take in the people, turn around and look at the people who you've had this experience with, who you've had these conversations with. We are very human. We do horrible things, and we do some of the most incredible things we can never even dream of. I can't wait to see, Emory, where you all dream next in terms of racial healing, racial justice, and liberation. And I just want to thank Vice Provost Henderson again and all the people who organized this conference, and to thank you. That's all I got.